Good morning, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar hosted by the Lansing Regional Chamber of Commerce in partnership with our great friends at Foster Swift, Collins and Smith, and of course, Dewpoint. Joining us today will be Donald Cornish, Chief Information Security Officer at Dewpoint, and Taylor Gast, an attorney at Foster Swift. Today, we will be discussing cybersecurity and data protection, which have always been important, but even more so now during this COVID-19 pandemic. The current concerns and how to guide your team as they're working remotely, some of the long-term implications for your IT security, and what some of these work-from-home policies might mean on the future of your workforce. Just a quick little process piece as we go through this webinar. Both panelists will have short presentations and will be sharing their screens with us. We ask them to speak for no more than 20 minutes, so 20 minutes each, so that gives plenty of time at the end for questions. To submit a question, please use the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen. I'll be moderating those questions and we'll be kicking them back to the panelists at the end of the program. And all participants right now are muted, and there will not be shown on video or nothing other than the three of us in the presentations. With that being said, I'd like to kick it off to Don to get us started this morning. We've got a lot of information to cover, and thank you so much for joining us. And Don, if you'd like to share your screen, let's get started.
Well, thanks very much. Can you see my screen?
I can.
Okay, good. Just wanted to make sure before we got started. So welcome everybody. My name's Don Cornish. As indicated, I'm the Dewpoint Chief Information Security Officer for it. And I'd like to just go through a number of different topics that I've got with regard to the cybersecurity and just make me, yeah, I'm not. There we go, just getting the agenda to come up. So what I'd like to cover today is basically looking at a few things. One is, where are we today regarding your security posture, given the situation that we've just all going through and over the last few weeks. Then taking a look at, okay, what does the future then look at like once we come out of this this situation, hopefully in the sooner rather than later. But you know, what's the future going to look like, and what's the potential implications for your security program? Then what are some long-term implications from it? I'm sure there's been a lot of change in the organizations as to how things are being done. So what are those long-term implications for a security program? And then once we've covered that, I've got a couple of hint slides that may or may not be new to some of you. One around just some best practices for working remotely. Another one is around some security management suggestions for your security program. And then finally, some websites that may give you some useful information. So with that, we'll move on to where are we today and what does it look like? So based on the activities of the last couple of weeks for it, the objective of most businesses is to keep them open and to be able to support your clients and servicing products, etc. for it, but generally with a lot fewer staff on site. Some instances and some organizations may actually have no staff on their physical sites anymore, but they're still able to provide the services and the products that their clients need. So what are the security implications that that brings with it for it? Because when your staff are no longer in the locations where they normally work, there is a change in your risk posture. So what we need to look at is what has changed from a risk management perspective. With your staff in the office for it, you've got a controlled environment that from a physical perspective as well as an IT perspective. Now that you've probably got a lot of staff working remotely for it, the risk landscape and the physical posture of your organization has changed dramatically. So what has that done to your organization from a day-to-day risk management standpoint for it? So those things are some of the fundamentals that we know have taken place over the last couple of weeks, and we need to keep in mind the implications of those as we go forward. So the next area is, well, where are your staff working from right now? So they're delivering services, they're on systems, no doubt, IT systems that are connecting into your various IT services, etc. So with working remotely, do I need to be concerned about it? So what happens from a home office location for it? I know a number of organizations, their staff are working from home. So the first question is, okay, so what's the home network set up like? How secure is it? Is device sharing happening at home? Depending on what your approach has been, a number of organizations, of course, weren't able to provide their staff with business provided infrastructure and laptops, etc. for it. So they've had to utilize perhaps their own personal devices. Well, what does that mean from a work security perspective for it? And if they are using home devices, there's nothing wrong with it. The problem that it does, or the challenge that it brings to the organization, is who else has got access to that device? Generally, if you're in an office environment, most devices are allocated to a particular individual. So from a security perspective, we're able to identify who does what, because each user has a unique ID to log onto the device and onto the systems. When you're at home and you're using a personal device, that may not be the situation. It could be a shared family computer that's now having to be used. So does that mean the kids, the wife, the husband, other members of the family are accessing that device? And if so, what does the implication then for any potential work data that's on that device? How's that being handled? Who's got access to it? Is there sensitive information, company information that you really don't want other people to see or to be widely known? The other part of it, if you're in the office, generally the situation is that the office environment will have some sort of backup capability. So your work files may or may not be sitting on your local hard drive, but there's generally a mechanism for them to be backed up to a more central repository so that they're secure and safe from deletion, etc. Well, now that you're at home, is there a lot more work activity happening and being stored on the device at home as compared to what would be happening there? And if you don't have a backup facility or capability at home, what happens if that device actually does have a hardware malfunction and say the drive fails, or it gets a virus and it actually gets wiped out from that perspective? How do you recover your information from that particular scenario? So those are some of the things that you need to be thinking about if you've got people, staff members working remotely from home, and the way that they're actually conducting their day-to-day business is different to what they would normally be doing if they are in the office. From a data security perspective, as I mentioned, in the parlance of the security space, the BYOD, bring your own device, is very much the topic of discussion for it. With bring your own device, it has a number of different implications for an organization. One of which is, okay, I'm using my own personal device for business activities. How much does the business expect me to be able to segregate my personal data from my corporate data? And if I can segregate my corporate and personal data, then from a corporate perspective, what can the organization do as far as managing policies, as far as perhaps being able to delete corporate data off there that's not going to impact my own personal data? So if you've gone down the BYOD, the bring your own device scenario, and you don't have a strategy around how to answer those sorts of questions, you definitely need to start thinking about them for it. There are a number of technologies that can assist in that. They usually go by the name of MDM, mobile device management, and that allows you to utilize technology for segregating work and personal data, so that various policies can be applied to the device as to what it can and can't do with respect to work. However, it doesn't necessarily impinge upon the way people use their devices personally. All right. Also, what other additional things can be done to reduce the risk with the people working from home for a scenario. Connectivity is one thing. So if you're at in a work or a home scenario for it, and you've got a Comcast, say, internet connection, do you have another router firewall device in your home network? If so, how's that set up? Hopefully it hasn't just been set up with just the default credentials that came out of the box, but you've been able to go in, manage that, set up a specific administrative account with a different password, etc., and be able to manage the home workers have been able to manage it and set it up that way for it. Just so for awareness sake, devices that you say buy from Best Buy, etc., those home routers and what have you, certainly are good at providing some segregation from a home network perspective, but they do need to be set up appropriately. Definitely changing administrative passwords, administrative accounts is a must, because you can go out onto the internet and you're able to find out what the device or what the default credentials are that they come out of the box with. And it may be as simple as admin for it, and people need to change those. If they haven't done it, they certainly should be, because the malicious actors know all this information as well, and they'll just trawl the internet looking for devices that have not had those default credentials changed. So definitely make a awareness of for your staff as to how they should be setting up various activities for it. If you have a VPN or virtual private network connection for it, make sure that your staff use it. There's been a lot of discussion about should I or shouldn't I go through a VPN connection for it. The one advantage of a VPN connection is that they'll usually terminate on a corporately managed device, and then if users need to go out to, say, the internet for a web activity, or they need to get, say, to a Microsoft Office environment up in the cloud for it, you're actually going through a corporately managed connection and back out to the internet. And so filtration rules, content filtering, blacklist, whitelist, blocking capabilities are all provided at your corporate interface, which is something that would not be available generally from a home perspective. So if you've got that capability, I'd definitely be recommending to people that they actually take advantage of it. Right. The other thing to be aware of is, are there any new risks that have come into my environment because I've had to implement new business processes? We've seen things like conferencing, you know, what's happening today, how you're getting this information through a video conference service. If you've been watching and you're into IT, etc., you've probably seen on the news things like Zoom conferencing taking off exponentially because of the pandemic and the remote working situation. But with that brings various challenges as well. They've had some security issues with conferences being compromised, etc. So you definitely, if you're starting down that path, be aware of what some of the constraints and the limitations are on those services. Also, from data sharing perspective, if you're going down into like the SharePoint, Teams, that sort of thing, certainly good technology, but be aware of what you're actually opening yourself up to and how to control it appropriately. Things like cloud service providers and cloud storage, you've got software as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service. All of those are probably getting more and more used by this particular scenario. One thing that you still need to be aware of from that perspective is that you still have responsibilities with respect to the privacy and regulatory requirements for various your data sources. So just be aware of those. If you're signing up for new cloud services, please take the time to read through the agreements for it, because you definitely have responsibilities. When you go into the cloud, don't assume that the cloud provider is going to do all your security for you. They'll secure their environment to the best of their ability, but there's a overlay of additional security requirements that you still are responsible for. The other thing to be aware of is that your regulations and your compliance requirements still apply no matter where your workers are located. So just be aware of that. If you're in a regulated industry that has HIPAA, PII, PCI type data, etc., those compliance requirements are still applicable to you. So please make sure that you're aware of those and your workers are aware of it as well. with that said, what's the future going to look like? Hopefully this doesn't last and drag on for too much, but when everybody comes back to the office, and we get back to business as usual, if people have been using their home personal devices, how are we going to get that information from their personal device perhaps back into a corporate system if it's not there already? So you need to have some plan, some mechanism that's been sanctioned as to how that's going to go on for it. It may be that as an organization you you provide USB or backup devices that people can utilize to basically transfer files from their home system back onto a corporate system. Maybe as simple as that for it. You definitely need to be aware that if you are using things like USB drives, that they're not infected with viruses, because that is quite a common technology and a mechanism for propagating them. If you're going to continue with remote working, is it going to be part of your ongoing operations? It may find a lot of organizations have been forced into remote working. They may have been dabbling with it beforehand, and now their hands really been forced for it. So, you know, if it is going to become part of your ongoing environment and your ongoing operational processes, take the time to formalize it. Make sure that you actually know what you're able to do, what your expectations are from a business perspective, as well as what the expectations are on your end users for it. To go hand in hand with that is, you know, you may now find that you have to update any IT security policies and procedure documentation for it. Do you need additional new documentation, particularly if you're getting down into the BYOD, the bring your own device, if it's going to be a officially sanctioned way of working in the organization for it, you need to basically perhaps revisit things like acceptable or responsible use documents. They're documents that you provide to your employees so that gives them the outline as to what they're expected to do, how it's supposed to work, what they should be handling, and that sort of thing. So basically, from a BYOD perspective, also it gives you the ability to look at MDM, as I mentioned before, mobile device management solutions, and they will help you enforce things like malware encryption, device compartmentalization, as I mentioned before. So, you know, in the future, when this settles down, or if you've got the time now, you might it may be worthwhile for you to start thinking about these different activities that governance activities that need to maybe needing to sit over the top of your organization once things settle down. And then if we look at from a long-term perspective, what are the implications for a security program? The fundamental one that I always maintain as from an organization perspective is you've still got to do the basics. The basics, no matter how we're working, still apply. So we've still got to work out and understand what's important to the business and how do we protect it. Things like identity and access management are going to become more and more critical. So as I mentioned at the start there, we need to know who's accessing our data, how they're getting access to it, what authorizations they have, what limitations do we impose on them. You should definitely be imposing or working to a paradigm that's called least privilege from an identity and access management standpoint. And that simply means that you give people enough permissions and capabilities to do their job, but they don't have more than that. And that means that gives you a level of protection that should credentials get compromised, that a malicious actor who compromises those credentials can't get through to systems that they should otherwise not be allowed to. Going hand in hand with that is to make sure that your data classification takes on a new level of importance, because that's where you're going to need to know what is important to be protected, how you're going to protect it, and it also gives you the ability to determine if you have an incident, what the level of severity of that incident is and how to react to it. A lot of organizations, unfortunately, have not taken the time to work out and actually formally identify what are the critical components of their business from a data classification, a system classification. What is it that they really need to protect? Because hopefully not in your organization, not everything's of the same level of importance. If that's the situation, you're going to be in a lot of trouble should you have an incident, because you're not going to be able to focus your limited resources on being able to protect what is critical and key to the business to keep it going. As well as that, as I mentioned earlier, backup and data retention are still required. So you still need to be able to back up your data. You still need to be able to make sure it can be retained for as long as needed from a business perspective. You need to be able to restore it. So all those fundamental security and business IT services still need to be applicable in today's strange way of working or different way of working, but it will still be equally applicable going forward. And if for those of you that may or may not be aware, there's a framework out in the industry called, from CIS, the Centre for Internet Security. Research has been done. They have about 20 different requirements that they've listed from, and they're very operationally focused, which means that from a small medium-sized business, they actually give you good guidance on where the rubber hits the road and what you should and shouldn't be focusing on. The research on those particular framework has actually indicated that doing the first 10 of their 20 requirements, if you can put those in place, you're going to reduce your risk profile by around about 70 to 80%, which is a far cry from actually doing nothing. So as a recommendation, I'd suggest if you haven't looked at those and you have an IT and a security organization, you certainly take the time. If that's not your core business, certainly you can reach out to Dewpoint and we can work with you to help you take a look at that. From a learning from this event, what I'd really recommend is that the organizations take time to stand back and work out what has worked well. What have you had to implement that you otherwise would not have, or have had to expand considerably that was outside the norm? And take the time to document it. Who knows, hopefully in the future we're not going to have another one of these pandemics, but hey, if we do, you should be in a much better situation to be able to pull out a document and go, okay, what did we do in this scenario? How did we structure ourselves? What worked? What didn't work? Take the time to look at what didn't work so well and take some time to think, well, what could have been done to improve it or to make it so that we don't have that same challenge going forward. And looking at the last area is around a formal business continuity plan. If you don't have one, I'd really recommend that you should have a look at one of creating one. It doesn't have to be totally an onerous document for it, but at least get it down on paper as to what is the business continuity approach for it. Which are your important systems? What are the important data elements? How does it work? The information flow through your organization. Typical areas that are going to come into play there are finance, your supply chain, if you're in manufacturing requirements, HR, any regulatory, as I said before, your regulatory and your compliance areas are still going to be applicable for it. So make sure that you don't lose sight of those. Also identifying the critical business functions that need to continue to operate. Hopefully you're able to prioritize those and you're able to then make sure that from a business continuity standpoint, you know what's needed, how it's going to play out, and who the key players, key systems are. Going hand in hand with that is around the key decision makers. So from an organization perspective, when you start to get into these sort of incidents, you need to actually have the key decision makers understanding their roles, already identified, ready to be able to make those decisions rather than going into a mode of, okay, I now have to do a whole lot of research and analysis, and which is just going to slow the business down and divert their attention from where they really need to be. Also, as fundamental to any organization is looking at what are the essential IT systems that need to keep the business operational. Right, so if you can document those, even at a high level from a business continuity standpoint, you'll be in a much better situation to look or handle such things from a long-term standpoint. with that said, here's some suggested remote worker helpful hints. Some of these may or may not be relevant to you because you may have already looked at having to address them. But, you know, for your remote workers, some best practices there are making sure that they've got space where, pardon me, that's dedicated to work so that they are able to work in a not a distracted environment. They're able to work in a focused location. They've got what they need, and that site or that location in their home is hopefully being able to focus on, allow them to focus on what they need to do for it. If you're publicly viewing spaces, if you're working from home and video chatting, etc., make sure that the video frame is relatively stable, that you don't have a background that's going to flare out and what have you. So there's a number of different tricks of the trade that you'll actually see from that perspective if you go out on the websites. The other thing is sometimes you'll find that your networking speeds are going to vary. Certainly from a remote worker perspective, if you've got the kids home, they're streaming video over the same network link as you're trying to conduct business for it. You need to be aware of those different components and how they're going to impact the infrastructure and your capabilities. So there are a number of tools out there. Microsoft's got a basic network speed tester for it. So certainly helps people to understand that you know, different applications and different functions are going to chew out your bandwidth, and so if you're having impact on your business because people are working from home, it could be as simple as us having to ask the kids to stop streaming their videos for it. The other part around it is, if you can, is to go and use a wired connection. So if you're in an office, in a home office, and you've got a router, run the wire as compared to a wireless connection. You'll actually get less contention on the lines from other devices. Also, you'll find that routers can be set up pardon me, so they have QoS, which is quality of service. So you can dedicate more bandwidth, more higher priority to your work computer as compared to, say, streaming videos and games and that sort of thing. So they're just some of the suggestions from a work from home perspective. If you've got a help desk, you may also want to look at how you resource that and monitor your call queues carefully, because you'll probably find that there's more calls coming in from people who are not used to working from home in a remote sense, and so the assistance that they require may have changed compared to if they're in the office. Some basic security program hints around password, that sort of thing, VPN, keep your endpoint, pardon me, endpoint protection up to date, use encryption if you can for it. If you're not in front of a device, log out. And if you have security training, I'd suggest you actually look at perhaps running some refreshers from that perspective. And with that, this is the last slide from my side. Pardon me. Here's some useful sites that will give you some information around best practices and staying safe when you're working remotely or working in this situation or a scenario like we have today. So appreciate your time and thanks for your attention. Handing back.
Thanks so much, Don. Taylor, take it away for us.
Thanks. Great information. Let me get my slides pulled up here. So my name is Taylor Gast. Looks like we should be able to see all that, correct? Good, okay. My name is Taylor Gast. I'm an attorney at Foster, Swift, Collins & Smith. I specialize sort of within our business and tax practice group. I do a lot of work on technology issues, which has inevitably led to a significant need for our clients' cybersecurity risks, and you know, in particular, you know, data breaches, remediating those, and advising on kind of related issues. So what I wanted to talk about today is actually in a very broad sense, I think very similar to what Don was just talking about. You know, what has changed, what hasn't, and how do we address some of these risks? But I'll take a little kind of a high level and legal perspective on this, so we'll get some additional information in here that that'll hopefully be helpful for our participants here, and you know, and looking at some of the issues here. So what has changed? From my perspective, what's changed is really, in a broad sense, the rise of remote work. And we have all sorts of writers and commentators in the news commenting on this right now. This could be a watershed moment for working from home if we can pull it off. It might be a tipping point in favor of everybody working from home on a much higher volume. And then we have some who are a little more concerned about it. And so we have this writer, thinking of this as a huge stressful experiment in working from home, and that this is just kind of a very strange test for our future. And I think all of those perspectives are probably accurate. For some of us, this has been a fairly smooth transition. For many of us, there are many concerns, and there's sort of this odd diminished barrier between work and home now. And from a risk posture perspective, which Don mentioned and began to touch on, there are some very serious implications. And I think it's important to think about how has that risk posture changed as a result of the very significant increase in us all working from home. So I would really summarize what has changed as from the perspective of vectors and volume. And when we're talking about cybersecurity and technology issues and information security, we're often thinking about attack vectors and how can our systems be infiltrated or compromised, and in a sense, working from home really increases the number of vectors that we have and changes what those vectors are. So like Don said, we, instead of a very controlled office environment, we now have a whole host of individual devices, which may or may not be work devices, might be personal. We also have a subset in terms of vectors, when we're talking about the various applications that we're using. So, Zoom, our work from home software, all of these are connected technology, are additional vectors that we were not previously using that could be a way that the company sees, a problem as it relates to information security and data privacy. And in addition, we're using these all of these new technologies in a much higher, much more frequent pace. So frequency of use and connected technology. And so it's led to these interesting conversations around, for instance, we've got Zoom and Zoom bombing, which has been pretty frequently in the news, that is an interesting kind of, data point for us all. And if you're not familiar, there have been a whole host of news stories discussing, how Zoom meetings have been set up in a way where just about anybody can access them, and potentially we might be talking about very sensitive topics. And if our links to these meetings are either made public or easy to find for interested parties who may be interested in disrupting that. We're seeing, people jumping in and sharing things that the meeting participants don't want to be seeing. But what's interesting to me is, some of how this applies in reality is not really that different. We still have laws and we still have rules that cover all of these things, which leads to our kind of piece on the right there with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Department of Justice in the Eastern District of Michigan coming out and reminding, Zoom bombers that, let's see how funny it is after you get arrested. So, we have systems in place to cover a lot of these issues, but it has changed based on these vectors and volume. Last point I'd mention just on this point is that I don't know if this is common among everybody, but at least personally, I have seen that, as this has become more of an emergency and we're dealing with things on a very quick basis, it's easy to change our workflow. It's easy to think of things and kind of compromise some of the checks that we have on information security. So for instance, to give a more concrete example, it's really easy when things are moving at a faster pace and we're in a casual environment at home to receive an email with a link to maybe a Zoom meeting or something of that nature, and think that this is a little bit more expected right now. And it's easy to click on those links and open up a can of worms from an information security perspective. That could be a problem. So, it's worth just thinking about that pace of work, and are we really considering the risks and all of that? And do we have systems in place to remind our workers who are working remotely to acknowledge those risks and, think carefully before we're clicking on our links. So, we have some things that have changed, but, to my mind, a number of really important factors, similar to what Don was saying, really haven't changed. We have very similar risks. We have all sorts of technology applications that are vectors, into our system and are ways that our information, our sensitive information, can be compromised. We may have additional vectors and we might be using them more frequently, but at the end of the day, data security incidents and data breaches are not going to slow down for us just because, maybe work is happening a little more slowly or less efficiently at home, or, some of our businesses are shut down. We really want to think about, and I think Don touched on this as well, if we've set up some of our new technology solutions quickly, if we've set those up, because we have a need and because we suddenly are going to be forced to work remotely, did we set those up correctly? Did we, have we set up the right security protocols? Have we thought about the right, institutional policies to make sure that we're handling those correctly? And I think that Don did a great job of summarizing some of the issues there. Similarly, what hasn't changed, we still have people sending phishing emails, and if anything, they're looking to capitalize on COVID-19. We're seeing, for instance, as a subject line being used in some of our phishing emails now. And at the end of the day, a lot of these issues really just fall down to human error, and that's the common factor with all of this. And I tend to think of it, maybe it might come across as a little pessimistic, but at the end of the day, this is a statistics game for a lot of these criminals. So eventually, if I send out enough phishing emails or enough of these scams, or if I target enough networks, eventually I'm going to get in. Somebody's going to be unprotected, and it's going to rely on, in a lot of cases, human error. So what can we do to address that and think about that? And that's remained the same. I think Don did a great job of covering the kind of Wi-Fi issues, so I'll gloss over that for the moment. I'll hit a little closer on the applicable laws, regulations, and contract terms, however, because I think that this is a pretty prominent issue that can help us guide how we're thinking about the issues that are in play here, and how we're considering the applicable risks. Because when we're considering what hasn't changed, very importantly, the rules and regulations and contracts that we've already signed up for, none of those have changed. And there really won't be any compromises, just because we have some level of exigent circumstances because we're working from home. And I'll touch on a little more on that in a moment here. And the other thing I would just mention that hasn't changed is our insurance policies. I completely agree that the risk posture of the organization is one of the concepts that we really want to be thinking about. And to the extent that we have additional vectors and we have, additional volume of use of these sort of risk-based issues, there's increased risk, and that might cause us to think about, the company's insurance policies. If you have a cyber insurance policy, maybe the fact that we're working remotely now causes us to either increase the policy or make sure that we're covering the appropriate aspects of working from home, and that all of that's covered. It's very much worth reconsidering that now. And not just for this temporary period, but again, going forward, if things are permanently changed now, and we are going to have more people working remotely, we might think that we have a higher risk, posture that warrants a different insurance level. There's also the possibility that is in the news that maybe there's another spike in cases in the fall, and maybe we come to find that we're all working remotely for sort of a separate, discrete period. So this very well could be happening again. And how are we ready for that? And how are we going to deal with that? I'm going to touch on, I mentioned applicable laws, regulations, and contract terms. So let's talk about some of the contract issues. A lot of our clients are, we have reviewed contracts for them that have very similar language to what's on the slide right now. And if not, they may themselves have drafted similar language into their contracts and be concerned about whether, their vendors, for instance, might be complying with this. So it's really important to be thinking about, our contractual obligations, and it's really easy to only be thinking about the risks in just kind of a conceptual, basis, or only in terms of what the laws and regulations say. But I think it's really helpful to get kind of more concrete by thinking about our contracts. So if we look at some of the obligations here, and just for background, I actually went in and pulled this from some of our standard language and some of the clauses that we've actually seen. So I can promise you that these are in contracts everywhere, frankly. So we have, for instance, that Party A. Let's think of our company as Party A. Party A agrees to use or disclose the data that's at issue in the contract only as permitted or required by this agreement. How does that change by, now we have, for instance, we've set up a remote access protocol where our employees have access, and the level of access and the access rights may be different than our work computers. If we haven't set that up to mirror our access rights, they may be able to access, use, and disclose information differently than we previously contemplated and felt, comfortable with as it relates to this term. What if, for instance, we can now our employees can now download information to their personal computers, and is that, in and of itself, potentially a use or disclosure that's not permitted under a contract? Are they, perhaps using the same laptop with their families, and their families are now, potentially permitting third-party software to come onto the computer, and since it's stored locally, maybe that's an access or disclosure risk. Second item there, the Party A, our company, must report to our counterpart, Party B, in writing of any unauthorized use or unauthorized access to the data. Could be pretty significant if we don't have a great system for tracking and monitoring our remote systems. And it might be pretty difficult to track depending on the system and how we've set it up. But we really want to make sure that our employees are, knowledgeable about what is permitted and what isn't, and what we need to kind of raise up the chain if we do or suspect a data security incident. The third item there, have we, as Party A, established and maintained appropriate technical and physical safeguards? Well, that might have changed the moment we flipped the switch to permit remote work. We have plenty of clients for whom we've been discussing the fact that they didn't really have a remote, access system or protocol before COVID-19, and as a result, they very quickly had to set this up, and understandably, we quickly made that available. But we still have, a contract or multiple contracts out there that say we have appropriate and technical physical safeguards, appropriate technical and physical safeguards, excuse me. And are those technical safeguards on top of our access systems and remote work systems, are they appropriate? Are they being managed properly? And are we, minimizing our risks there. It's worth thinking about. Are we limiting access to the data outside of the contracting parties? So again, that pretty clearly relates to shared computers, and how how an employee may or may not be able to access information and share it outside of their system. Another item that's been increasingly a concern even before COVID-19 has been vendors and companies' vendors. And we have increasingly seen a desire by both our clients and our clients' vendors and customers to limit, the use of the data that's at issue in our agreements as it relates to their vendors. So to kind of put it in more concrete terms, if our client has very sensitive data that they are working to process through a vendor, it's an increasingly been a best practice to make sure that that vendor is vetted and made sure that the vendor can only use the data for in the same way that agreement, the other terms that I've listed here, we have the same physical, technical safeguards and other kind of policies in place to make sure that those vendors are equally protecting that sensitive data just as much as we are. We might be worried that our vendors are doing that as a company, and we might also be, subject to those requirements from other companies as their vendor. So it's worth thinking about this as kind of a two-way street in both ways. And then lastly, I kind of touched on already, but we may be requiring and we may be required to investigate, mitigate, and remedy unauthorized access or use or disclosure of sensitive data. And the important kind of piece here is what is the definition of a data security incident? Have we had one? Are we able to detect them? And how do we react when we think that one may have occurred? And are we informing, if this is another party's data, are we informing them, and how are we deciding whether to inform them? These are all questions that we really need to make sure that we have an answer for. So lastly, I'll just kind of move through this on maybe more of a policy level. With the contractual examples are good ways to a little more concretely think about how we're handling these. But it's just worth reminding ourselves that, regardless of where it happens, a data breach is still a data breach. A work from home data breach is also still a company data breach. So are we prepared to detect that? And are we prepared to respond to that? And if we haven't thought about as a company, how can our information and our access and permitted access, how can that potentially lead to unauthorized access to sensitive personal information? And we want to think about what personal information do we have? We're not only just talking about social security numbers, credit card numbers, and the like. We're really talking about much more broadly information that is important to the company, and we want to take a broad view of that and not just be worried about those sort of traditional pieces of information. And so, particularly if we're in a regulated industry, if we're in a healthcare space, if we're in an education space, if we're in a financial services space, any regulated industry, which are many, would lead us to kind of second guess and just rethink and be constantly thinking about how are we defining that important information. And then, do we have appropriate policies and technical solutions? Like I said, to detect a data breach. We've talked about various plans and policies in place. Do we have an incident response plan? That's one that I'm always really concerned about when working with our clients. And that should really describe who's on our team if there is an incident. How are we triggering the use of that plan? And that goes back to understanding when we have unauthorized access to personal information. And, what other steps are we taking? How are we, messaging this with the public? When should we call law enforcement? Who should we call first? And although it's a little self-serving, I'll just note that the legal counsel piece of this is very important, even if we have inside counsel, because there's a privilege aspect to this that's just important to keep in mind. And what we know on day one of an incident varies greatly compared to what we know just a few hours later versus a week later versus a month later. And we want to be sure that we can kind of shield, to the extent that it's reasonable, that developing conversation, because what we think that incident is on day one may look very different than a few weeks out. We don't want people to think it is what we thought it was on day one. So I'll just kind of wrap up here by saying, let's take a really close look at our policies and procedures and security settings. And we have increasingly considered this as an issue that could be a competitive advantage for our clients, our business clients as well. This isn't just a compliance regime, a bunch of laws that need to apply and be a kind of a negative thorn in the sides of our business clients. This is potentially a positive for you, to the extent that we're meeting obligations, and we can message out to our clients and our customers that we're doing so. We have a number of businesses out there that are very prominently making clear how we're protecting information, and customers and clients really appreciate that right now. And that can truly be a competitive advantage that maybe even gains market share to the extent that we're doing that successfully. So just another item to think about, and something that we're seeing an increasingly in conversations. So with that, I think we can move on to questions, and I'll open that up.
Great. Thank you both so much for all of the information. Obviously, working remotely safely is a critical component for all of our businesses, and to maintain that great customer relationship, make sure you're making it a priority. I do want to go through just a couple of quick questions here. We've got about 10 minutes, so that'll work great. We did see a question: do you expect to see a rise in corporate provided IT equipment? Would this help with security going forward?
I'll take a go at it. Corporately provided IT equipment. It comes down to certainly a business decision and a business, because of the cost factor. Just because it's corporately provided, you need to have the ability to also manage it. So if I look at the scenario, hey, work gives me a computer, I take it home, but it never connects back to my work control environment, let's call it. What has that really done for my security posture? In my opinion, not much. So you've got to look at it in a holistic manner for it. If work is going to provide you with a compute and a hotspot and that sort of thing for it, you then have to look at, okay, how is work going to manage those? How are we going to make sure that they maintain their security posture? What policies are going to be applied to them? How do we make sure that their endpoint protection software is updated? How do we make sure that the Microsoft patches, yesterday was Patch Tuesday, so how do we go through all, getting that up to date? And, so it's much broader in my eyes than saying, here, have a hotspot and a laptop that work pays for, and off you go and do your job. You've got to look at it holistically. Otherwise, all you're doing is basically spending funds, but you're not helping your security posture or protecting the organization. So I'd say, I think there's probably going to be a run on it for it. And those of you that may have watched the press when this first started to roll, at one stage Dell actually ran out of PCs. They could not supply PCs out to their customers because their stock just basically was exhausted for it, because organizations were going, hey, everybody's working from home, we're going to give them a laptop and off they go. Well, that's, as I say, only one part of it. So certainly think holistically. It may help if you've got a mechanism that you can keep the management and the control of that device. It's definitely going to help your security posture. And it is all about basically trying to contain and reduce your risk, the attack surface for it. So basically, if you can do that effectively, go for it. if you can't, I'd question what's the value from a business perspective, because you're outlaying hard cash to provide those components.
Yeah.
Sure. And how can a company work with their employees to make sure that their home networks and their home devices are safe? You know, what's the best messaging and approach there?
There's a number of ways. There's an organization called SANS. They run courses and they can help that sort of thing. Otherwise, you can reach out to, you know, the IT support community, vendors like Dewpoint, number of those that do provide services. They're able to advise and help people, help organizations set that up. From a business perspective, depending on the methodology and your business structure for it, you may decide that you're actually going to start doing things like standardizing, you know, from an office perspective. We call it sort of like office in a box. It's almost like saying, okay, a home office in a box. Here, I'll provide to you a small home router that is configured to my corporate standards, etc., that sort of thing. There's a number of different business approaches to it. If you've got people that actually, you know, hey, you've got a security and an IT organization, leverage the resources you've got in-house for it. You know, your network people know how to set up a corporate network. Hey, a home network's just a mini corporate network. So if you've got best practices there, see if you can leverage that intellectual property that you've got in your organization to help people at home.
Perfect. You know, when a business looks at sort of measuring their IT risk management, you know, what are the factors and the things that they should look at?
Yeah, I can jump in on that. You know, I think, you know, a few that we're thinking about are, you know, do we really have a good sort of handle on what information the company collects and how that is, you know, what access is permitted, and, you know, what systems do we have in place to protect against unauthorized access? Do we, for instance, have somebody whose responsibility it is to make sure that these are, you know, there are appropriate protections in place, that, you know, the security of that information is being looked after? Do we have a plan? Do we have a, you know, a process in place for both that person and their team, if they have, you know, if we have a large enough organization in that case, to be keeping on top of best practices, because this is evolving over time. And also, you know, is there some level of reporting up to the top of the organization to manage that? You know, what is the chain of command? Those are, you know, from my perspective, some of the key indicators, and I think there are a number, but, you know, the few that we've noticed more recently that, you know, indicate whether we're trying to keep on top of this or we have a more static, you know, program, you know, I think that makes a big difference.
Don, anything to add? Or?
Yeah, I'd say from a risk perspective, and unfortunately, I think it's just been a factor of life of the way, particularly small, medium businesses have evolved. From what I've seen in my work through Dewpoint and other engagements for it, small, mediums have tended to evolve and been very successful focusing on their core business competency for it, which may be providing a service or maybe developing and providing manufacturing component and that sort of thing. And they have never really stood back and gone, well, what is key to keeping my business going? Because the name of the game from a security perspective, what we're trying to do is actually support the business so it stays viable and stays going from that perspective. I know historically security used to have the mantra of the Department of No, so anything that was brought in was no. But from a risk perspective, what I've seen is a lot of small businesses, because of that or the way they've evolved, they've never really thought, what's critical to me? What are my key data elements? What are my key processes? What are my key IT systems that if I don't have those, I can't meet my functions core charter for it. If you don't have that identified and clearly understood, you can't do any risk management, because you basically, your risk management's got to be about identifying what is key, how do I protect it to an acceptable level, do I put IT controls in it, do I take basically, you know, an insurance approach of, hey, I can actually basically insure myself so that if it goes down, I can actually, you know, get some compensation to keep my business going. I think organizations, certainly in the small medium space, need to stand back and start thinking about those, because for them to grow, once you get big, it becomes a whole lot harder to actually put those controls in place. So do it whilst you're in a size, or you've got time to think about it holistically. And I think you'll be a lot more successful, you know, in managing your risk profile.
Yeah, that's a really good piece of advice. And as we kind of come up to the 11 o'clock hour, I want to kind of use this final question here for you to kind of provide your final thoughts as well. So, you know, obviously this pandemic has fundamentally changed the way that we work going right now, but potentially even more so, you know, as we look to the future. So as companies are going through this now and looking to craft and create successful work from home policies in the future, what do you think are kind of the main things to consider and the main things to look at when crafting those policies?
So from I take it two ways. There's the IT controls that they need to look at from a policy perspective. What is it that they're trying to do from that standpoint? And the other part of it is the education, end user awareness. Work from home is all about, okay, your end user is relocating to somewhere different to what they probably normally would do. Right. So from an IT control perspective, I'd still go back to the basics. You need to know, okay, what devices, what applications, who's there, and then what are the potential avenues of attack for it. So basically look at your policies and go, okay, now that my people are no longer in my office but are at home, how do those policies translate? Can I actually, to Taylor's perspective, can I measure it? Can I actually monitor things? If I can't monitor it, I can't control it from that standpoint. And the education part of it is basically you've got to communicate to your end users what their roles and responsibilities are. That, as Taylor rightly pointed out in his presentation, from a security control perspective, the weakest link now is well and truly recognized as being the person on the end of the keyboard. They click on that link and what have you, and then all hell breaks loose for it. So, you know, you've got to get that education out there. You've got to try and reinforce it, make the employee feel that they have some obligation and some skin in the game for it. Because I see a lot of employees think, well, that's IT's problem. That's security's problem. The fact that I did a stupid thing and clicked on the link, well, they'll go and clean it up for me. For it, there's got to be a feeling of ownership within the employee. And if you can get that, then I think you're well on the way to having a successful remote or work from home type program. But you also need those policies and around BYOD, what you can and can't do.
Sure, Taylor?
Yeah, and I would just add, you know, I think the concept of risk and risk management is really key here. And to that point, you know, are we appropriately measuring the risk here? And from my perspective, again, going back to this human error piece as well, I have a hard time even saying anything, but it's not if but when we talk about some of these issues too, when it comes to data breaches and data security incidents. And if it's not if, it's when, then we really need to be ready to respond to a problem when it occurs. And so are we ready to respond to a data breach if it occurs? And, you know, if we're really trying to think about the future and we're really trying to be prepared into the future, from my perspective, looking at the rules and the regulations that are coming about right now, within the foreseeable future, things may look very different, and we may have significantly more stringent rules that are applying to most businesses as to the level of data protection that's required, the amount of risk that's imposed, not just from a business perspective as to whether we're violating a contract or we have a data breach, but rather, if it's baked into a generally broadly applicable law that comes about, whether that's an update to state law or potentially a new federal law, which is potentially the direction that we're moving in. I think it's debatable whether that'll happen, but there are many who think that within the next maybe handful of years here, we may have a federal data privacy rule. And if that happens, this is just going to completely change the game. And the organizations that are already thinking about this and addressing it and doing the things that we've been talking about here today are the ones that are going to be ready and aren't going to need to spend, ridiculous amounts of time and effort to get into a compliant state. So those are things that I think are useful to be thinking about for our organizations looking to the future.
Well, both of you, thank you so much this morning. We appreciate your time. We appreciate your expertise. In terms of the program, we will be sending out a follow-up email that will include a link to the presentation, some presentation materials, some of the other links that were mentioned by the panelists, and just some information on some upcoming webinars that we are also hosting. So gentlemen, thank you so much for your time. Go enjoy this snowy April day.
Yes, it is snowing out there. Yeah. Thank you.
And on that note, thank you so much. And you guys have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.